Great, thank you, Aaron. Thanks for the introduction. It's worth starting with a point of principle. It may be self-evident to everybody here, but a fair, equal and inclusive society has to have the diversity of its whole represented in the constituency of its parts. Think about Parliament, the judiciary, the high levels of industry, or indeed the high levels of our armed forces, and our own higher education sector. The higher education sector is particularly important because it is the gateway to those other areas of society so often. It's the degrees we award, it is the contacts you make, it's the networks you form. And it is the gateway to those areas of society that are traditionally do have a poor record of diversity. The Earth Sciences has its role to play within the higher education sector. This is not just important for the higher education sector, but also for our science. The way we approach science is changing. In the past, we would rely on iconoclastic individuals to drive forward their particular area of science. But the future of our science is so much more with teams tackling complex, interrelated systems. Success, more often now, relies on the richness of our approach, different perspectives, communication skills, team building across different disciplines, and of course, always behind that, excellence in science. We need all the talent we can get if we are to tackle some of mankind's most significant and pressing problems, whether that's climate change, the natural hazards, or sustainable resources that we absolutely must have for a successful future society. And we have to attract the best into our subject, not just from one area of our constituency. The Earth Sciences at Oxford, we're a small to medium-sized department by UK standards. That's 35 undergraduates that we intake each year, 24 associate or full professors. And together with our postgraduate students, postdocs, research fellows, and faculty and support staff, we are a community of about 300 people. We're a STEM subject, that is science, technology, engineering, maths, and a subject that has struggled with diversity. And within Earth Sciences, we're no different. If you've ever been to our department, we have a stairwell which has pictures of our past faculty and our past undergraduates. And one thing that is notable is the lack of diversity in our department in the past. We have been improving things, in particular in gender. When we look now at our undergraduates, we have a 50-50 male-female balance within our undergraduates. The same within our postgraduates, and also within our postdocs. But that line still is leaky. We are still losing talent in that leaky pipeline. Again, we're making progress in new faculty, and we will be 40% female, 60% male. So we're not there yet, but we are making some progress, but not in Black, Asian, and minority ethnic diversity. The university did shine a light on individual departments, individual colleges, and how we were doing in our diversity aspirations. And Oxford Earth Science undergraduate admissions between 2015 and 2017 was shocking. We were only 3.6% Black, Asian, or minority ethnic in constituency, and that is way below the national average. For context, the national average within Earth Sciences within the UK is about 10%, 10.2% to be precise. Within Earth Sciences, that is still not good. When you look at the students attaining 3 A's at A-level, 21.5% of those students are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. So Earth Sciences as a subject struggles to attract diversity into it. So we did look at this quite closely, and 2018 we started to refocus our outreach effort to attract more diverse applicants to our undergraduate cohort. We've started an engagement with leveraging the resources that colleges have, working with the Oxford Museum of Natural History, working with the resources available to us to increase our reach, take advantage of the databases, take advantage of the contacts, because we are a small department, we have limited resource, but we are lucky in that we have other aspects, other parts of our institute that do have resource that we can latch onto and use. We have doubled the number of outreach events that we're running. We've tripled the number of public engagement events. And what is doubling? What does tripling mean? In 2018, 2019, we ran 28 inbound schools to visit our department. And many of those were from geographic areas with higher proportions of Black, Asian and minority ethnic students. We've developed hands-on workshops, growing number of digital resources, and we've been developing support material for teachers. Our department has also spearheaded a change in the way we admit students. We have what we call a college blind admission process. You can look at details of that at another time perhaps, but this is a process that reduces real or perceived bias in our admissions process. It doesn't matter what college you apply to, you are just assessed on the quality of your application and performance at interview. Our current undergraduate population has moved upwards. We're moving in the right direction. We now have 9.7% of our UK undergraduates, our admitted undergraduates are from Black, Asian or minority ethnic backgrounds. It's risen because our most recent intake in 2019 was 21.4% BAME. You won't see this in the statistics yet, but the 2020 offers that we've put out are also greater than 20%. So we're clearly moving in the right direction. And it's not just BAME students that it makes a difference to. Our big engagement with schools and this big increase in program with schools has not just maintained our overall applications, but actually slightly increased it, which is against the trend that we see in earth sciences across the UK. There's been quite a lot of discussion on Twitter and other public media about potentially declining undergraduate applicants to the subject. Because we're putting this resource into engaging with a lot of school children, perhaps we're also bucking that trend. So when our students put together a report and told us that we were not doing enough, we had to look at this very closely. And they're absolutely right, we have not been doing enough. And I'm not going to say any more, but if I may pass across to Ben Fernando and Gwen Antel to describe the process that they've taken the department through and some of the details of their findings, then I think that will become apparent what we still need to do as a department. So if I may pass across to Ben, I will turn my mic off.
Perfect, thank you, Chris. Just to check before I start, can everyone see my screen? Yep. Yes, okay, perfect. So just to begin with, I'm Ben Fernandimer. I was meant to be a final year postgraduate student. I guess I'm now a penultimate year postgraduate student again, but such are the times in the earth sciences, in the geophysics group. And together with Gwen, we put together this report with feed-in from loads of the postgraduate, undergraduate, staff and academic communities. So before we get started, I'd like to say a massive thank you to those who fed into the reports, so especially Ricky, Roberta and JD, and then of course all the others who came along to our working groups, and to the staff and academics who helped us put together this response. So directly Connell, Izzy, Erin and Chris, and then for their thoughts, Taria, Tamsin, Rich especially. It was really great to hear what you had to say and engage with you on this issue. So the plan for my little bit is I'm not going to talk you through all the detailed conclusions of the report. If you want to follow along, the links in the chat so you can see which specific items I'm talking about, but just to give you an overview of the two separate sections that we put together. And they're by no means comprehensive. There are many other things that we probably could have thought about, many things that we didn't think about that we might want to in the future. But hopefully the idea of this is it will give you an idea of what sort of transferable frameworks you might be able to apply to your own department. Because of course we wrote this report just for Oxford initially, And it wasn't clear to us whether it would be useful to anyone else. But if it is, please do feel free to take as much of it as would be helpful in your particular context. So I think, as Erin said, if you have any questions as we're going through, please just do drop them into the chat, and then we can come to those at the end. Perfect. So we obviously recognize that if we want to address the diversity problems, whether that be in gender, LGBTQ, or ethnicity, that needs to start from recruitment. And it needs to start from recruitment at the undergraduate level and work its way through. That's not to say we don't need to stop losing people along the way, but fundamentally, if the people don't apply to do earth sciences as undergraduates, they're never going to be professors. So the first section of our report is all about student recruitment. And by that, we mean both undergraduate and postgraduate student recruitment. And I'll just briefly talk you through some of the overarching themes that we put in there and why we chose them specifically. So the first thing is something that I think is very much talked about, be it in the context of earth sciences or other STEM, that is science and technology degrees. There is a perception, and indeed it's true, that very often the students who have access to the best laboratory facilities at school, the best experiences of field trips, so on and so forth, are those who are disproportionately better off or privileged in some way. So we should make sure that we make a discernible effort to reach out to underprivileged communities specifically when we're doing outreach and public engagement work. And that doesn't just mean talking to the students, it also means talking to their families and talking to the communities that they come from, because there's where we need to build up the recruitment at the undergraduate level. And of course, many of those things will move through to postgraduate level as well. And part of that might include doing things like ensuring that the research that you showcase when you talk about your department is as diverse as it can be. You know, the sorts of things that I do sitting behind a computer, they don't always make for great field trip photographs, but by showcasing the full diversity of things that we're doing, we're able to appeal to the broadest range of undergraduates, postgraduates, and of course, those who will then work their way through the postdoc and professorial levels. The next thing to be aware is that familial and cultural expectations exist for everyone, whether they be from the UK, not from the UK, white or non-white. You can see that certain communities, for example, those who have a high proportion of disadvantaged individuals, might be more encouraging their children to take up jobs which provide some family security. Now, of course, it's very much not the case that doing an earth sciences degree is a route to not having a secure job. But for many individuals from those communities who might not know anyone who's been to that university, might not know anyone who's done a geosciences degree, there can be familial pressure to move towards more hands-on degrees, things like medicine or law or accounting. And we should just bear in mind when we're talking about that it's not always that students haven't thought about us as a subject or any other subject. It might be that they've reasoned through it and had good reasons for choosing not to study it. So by engaging with those concerns, by talking about the benefits that degree can bring, talking about why they might be uncomfortable with the idea of studying mining, say, if they're from an indigenous community in Central America, we can help to overcome some of those issues. So the next thing is cost. And again, this is something where, to be fair, if you're able to do some reading around the subject, it should be somewhat clearer that the earth sciences degree, at least to a UK undergraduate, does not cost many thousands of pounds more than a maths degree or a physics degree. But we should bear in mind that many of the communities that we're talking to, that we really want to reach, they might not realize that. And so we should be clear when we're talking about doing field work or going abroad for research experiences in earth sciences, we're not saying that individuals and their families and communities will necessarily have to pay more money for that. Now, of course, there is the other side of the coin, which is that some of the better experiences that you can have on a mapping project might cost money, and those should be addressed. But part of this is just reassuring people when they apply that we're not asking them to stump up many thousands of pounds for what look to be sort of semi-fun experiences. So the importance of role models and doing outreach in encouraging diversity is quite clear. And it's clear that if done well, it's one of the things that can most attract people to a subject, and if done badly, can be an enormous waste of time and money. So we would encourage our department, and indeed every other department, to think about how they can showcase the work of people from disadvantaged or ethnic minority communities, in addition to, for example, some of the great work that's been done around showcasing women in science. But to bear in mind that you don't want to just be nominating people from ethnic minorities because they're from ethnic minorities and then expecting them to pick up a larger or disproportionate fraction of the workload. So this is about showcasing and celebrating the achievements of the community so that people can relate to those that they see on the department website, for example, but bearing in mind that you don't just want to give the members of that community more work to do on top of their already disproportionate burdens. So the next thing is marketing materials. And I think to its credit, the department has made some great progress on this one already. It's again, for someone who knows nothing about university or geosciences, thinking about which degree to study, it can sometimes seem from looking at geology department or earth science department websites that it's all about going out in the field, it's all about being a long way from home, and very little about, hard mathematical, statistical, or coding skills. Now, of course, none of those things are necessarily true, and there's plenty of scope to decide upon what sort of geosciences experience you want to have during your degree. But we should take steps to reassure people in our marketing materials that they can tailor the degree to that which interests them the most. And finally, this is something which, as Chris mentioned, is perhaps particularly pertinent in an Oxford context. And I'll come back to it in my sort of take-home messages. But it's really important to look very carefully at the admission statistics, but not just at the overall numbers, but also to look at where we're losing candidates through the process. So in Oxford, a disproportionate fraction of the candidates who get the grades to come to Oxford in the end, but don't get an offer, are from an ethnic minority background. Similarly, as we'll talk about in a second, not all members of the BAME population fall out of the admission system, as it were, at the same point in time. So it's worth bearing that in mind when trying to come up with ways to address the problem. The population is not homogeneous. So the second item that we talked about is inclusion, because to some degree it's true, once we've got people in the system, they're undergraduates here, at least we've given them an initial step up. But as Chris said, the problem of this leaky pipeline can only be addressed by trying to understand some of the reasons that people have for leaving the system. And as Gwen will go on to talk about, many of these suggestions are not particularly specific to those from ethnic minority communities. They apply quite generally. So the idea is, by thinking about some of these things, hopefully we'll be able to make the workplace environment in geosciences more inclusive and diverse for everyone involved. So the first one was field work and field trips. Understandably, for reasons of cost and accessibility, the majority of field work that we do involves going to locations in Europe, and a lot of it is sort of, you might term it sort of structural geology, looking at big scale things, and it might be less obvious to someone coming in as an undergraduate how the work that they're seeing on a field trip relates to their community. So this is just a suggestion to bear in mind that there are more links that can be drawn between, for example, volcanic and earthquake hazards and communities, between the fact that not all geology is done in the countryside, some of it is done in cities, and trying to showcase as diverse a locations of field work that people do as possible, so not just those in Europe or North America. So the second thing is alcohol. Again, there's evidence, sort of peer-reviewed evidence on this, that the geosciences tend to be very alcohol focused in their socializing, and that's fine. We wouldn't mean to suggest that we should get rid of that in any way, but we should just bear in mind that for many students from ethnic minority backgrounds, for religious or cultural reasons, that can be somewhat uncomfortable. So for example, we've suggested to our department that there should be alternative methods of doing community service in addition to organizing the weekly happy hour. And that way you're not making students who don't drink or feel uncomfortable in that environment feel obliged to organize those sorts of social events for others. So the next thing is harassment. And again, this is one place where I think we've made some really great progress, in that there have been steps taken to ensure that there's a female member of staff or demonstrator available to undergraduates on field trips to talk about issues that might concern them. And similarly, there are multiple female harassment advisors who can offer help, training, help and support to those who have experienced an uncomfortable situation. Now, of course, there's not necessarily the numbers of BAME academics and postgraduates to have them be harassment advisors in the department without giving them a disproportionate amount of work. but it's worth perhaps ensuring that students and staff from ethnic minorities feel there is someone they can talk to who understands where they're coming from, even if they're not in the same department. So perhaps, the university as a whole could think about ensuring that at least one harassment advisor available across multiple departments is from an ethnic minority background. So the fourth thing was outreach. Again, members of the BAME community, members of other disadvantaged communities, are the best place to go into those communities and convince people to come study our subject. Of course, we don't want them to feel obliged to do that or that they have a disproportionate burden of the workload. So we would encourage departments to think very carefully about how they can incentivize and support outreach efforts without making them a disproportionate burden. So for example, that might include things like logging people's outreach hours to count towards a compulsory part of their degree that they're obliged to do, or indeed paying them and supporting them in travel so that they don't feel it's a disadvantage personally to them to do these sorts of things if they so wish. Again, so seminars is one where I'm really glad to see that our department's been making good progress, and we had a chat just last week about what we might be able to do on this front. Obviously, the seminars are for an academic purpose and we wouldn't wish to change that, but there's room to invite a more diverse group of speakers, some of them younger perhaps, or indeed talking more about geoscience and society in the way that we work and do things alongside the regular academic seminars. So we've been looking into that. I know others from universities across the UK are interested in doing this with us, and it'll be a really interesting thing to see whether we can try and showcase a more diverse range of speakers and topics in addition to the academic seminars that we usually run. And finally, it's just to bear in mind, of course, there are stereotypes that we shouldn't pander to about which communities like to study which subjects. But what we can try and do is allow the communities who want to come and study geosciences to in some way shape the courses that they're going to take. So for example, if there are course reviews happening, it might be that by offering a particular geophysics mathematics streamed focus, you can encourage a separate set of candidates to those who you would have if all you did was offer a specific geology focus. So this is not to sort of suggest that we should force people to go down one route or another necessarily, but just to bear in mind that broadening course provision can also mean that we get a broader cohort of undergraduates and then postgraduates interested in doing the degree. And the final thing is just to ensure that there's a route for continuing action. So this report, hopefully we won't be doing it every year because it took quite a lot of time to do, but it's important to make sure, as our department has done, that the points are addressed and that there are routes to monitoring and assessment to ensure that things are put into place, or indeed not put into place, but for good reason. So we just encourage, whenever you're having this sort of conversation, to talk to your department about how to manage the process and indeed make sure that we're able to move forward with the actions in a constructive but also sustainable manner, so that it's a program of continuous improvement rather than a report followed by many years of nothing. So just finally, some takeaway messages. These are by no means the departments, they're just mine, things that I think it's worth bearing in mind. The first is that the BAME population is not homogeneous. And I say that because it comes down to even most fundamentally the admissions process. At Oxford, those from a Black background are disproportionately underrepresented because they don't apply. So through the admissions and interview process, they actually get a very fair treatment, but it's the problem that they're not applying that means that they're underrepresented here. Students from a South Asian background, so British Indian, British Bangladeshi, British Pakistani, apply in a reasonable proportion, but they're actually disadvantaged through the admissions process, even if they have the same grades as their white counterparts. So again, it's quite clear if you're tackling the issue of ethnic representation, there are two very different problems there that need to be solved, one regarding outreach and one regarding admissions, and they target different parts of the BAME population. Secondly, I think, certainly when I'm doing outreach sometimes, we often adopt the attitude that people would come study our subject if only they knew it existed. But it's important to bear in mind that members of some communities might have very good reasons for not choosing to study that subject, whether those be financial or, if they're from a community which has had a historically, say, divisive relationship with geosciences in the way of mining or oil and gas, they might be put off. And of course, within the UK, some of those concerns might apply to those who've seen the decline of coal mining in the north of England. So it's important to engage with people and find out why they're not considering this degree, rather than just assuming that if we get a hold of them and tell them about geosciences, they'll come and study it. And finally, just to bear in mind that the cultural context is crucial, not just for BAME students, but for everyone. And I think there's a real lesson to be learned here in that we've seen sort of decolonizing initiatives in the humanities, which don't really apply here in the same way. But what we can do is ensure that we not only talk about the science, but also the relationship that that science has had with cultures and societies, both in the past, and, of course, the difficulties that that has led to, but also in the present and how it feeds into the things that we say and do today. Because that way we're not only engaging with some of those reasons that people choose not to study geosciences, but also encouraging the students to think more broadly about their actions, which in a context of equality, diversity, and inclusion can only be a good thing. So I'm going to finish up there and hand over to Gwen, who's going to talk a little bit more about the context of the report and intersectionality.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben. That was a really excellent summary of the whole report. And I'm glad that I could leave it to you to handle the broad overview. And I want to reiterate as well your thank you to the many different students who helped contribute to this work, and the many different staff members who have put in a lot of time engaging with it as well. In case you don't remember the brief introduction, my name is Gwen Antel. I'm at the end of my 3rd year as a DPhil student. I also want to point out right from the start, if you haven't already noticed, Ben linked in the chat a link to the report, so you're welcome to go check that out if you haven't already been following along. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just jump right in. As Ben mentioned, there's 2 topics that I want to talk to you about. So the first is intersectionality, and then the second is allyship. If I were to try and define intersectionality by drawing on my knowledge as somewhat of a statistician, I'd define intersectionality as this interaction term, a positive interaction between 2 or more groups of identifying characteristics. So basically, if you belong to 2 minority groups, you are more than doubly disadvantaged. For instance, the disadvantage faced by Black women is more than the sum of the independent disadvantages faced by Black men and white women. So let's relate this idea back to the recommendations in this report for the geosciences. We need to consider the ways that BAME people with multiple minority characteristics, say neurodiverse Asian women, are going to face additional barriers to inclusion that we haven't necessarily itemized in these 42 recommendations. And then at the same time, there's also a lot of obstacles that are shared in common with multiple marginalized groups. And this is actually somewhat of a good thing for those of us doing equality work, because it means that many of the recommendations in this report targeted for BAME people will also help with the inclusion of, say, white women and queer and trans folks and people with disabilities and various other groups. And I can speak to this personally because I'm not only white, I'm also a queer, chronically ill woman. So let's start with just a few examples, just a couple of the recommendations. I'll start with myself as a queer person, and I'll point out that when we stop forcing students of color to travel to field sites in countries where they feel uncomfortable or are in direct danger of violence, then we're also going to be helping out all of our LGBTQIA students whose existence is criminal in more than 70 countries. And I do want to pause and recognize how happy I was last week to hear that UCL's Geoscience department has made the decision to discontinue their required student trip to Oman. And then I can also speak as somebody who's registered with the Disability Services. And I can say that when we allow our students alternative arrangements to field trips, if they don't want to go afield for fear of racialized interactions, then we're going to be helping out our students with disabilities. We're going to help them access the accommodations that they need to stay in geoscience. And then finally, I can give an example as a woman. And I can say that when we review and we improve our access to harassment support and our policies about harassment, when we do that for people of color specifically, of course, we're also going to help white women who choose to come forward and report sexual assault or other unwanted advances. So I'll just stop with those 3 examples because I do want to keep us to time. But I hope that if you review this report with your own institution, you'll think about how each of your recommendations might be relevant to people, to other marginalized groups besides BAME people. And I hope that you'll also think about how BAME people who aren't cis able-bodied men are going to face additional barriers. So all of this is why we don't plan to write up a follow-up report with recommendations for diversity and equality of women in geoscience, and a separate report for queer and trans folks in geosciences, etc. My goal in general as a student activist, and specifically as a panelist here today, is to encourage a shift from a reductionist view of isolated social issues to a holistic intersectional view of interlocking systems of oppression. So this is going to bring me to the last topic, which is allyship. I've spoken with a lot of different people over the last month about EDI issues, and my impression is that right now there are a whole lot of white people in STEM who are becoming aware, perhaps for the first time, of some really harsh realities, who really earnestly want to help, and who don't know where to get started. So I want to share two different perspectives that I've seen on allyship that I think are very helpful, and maybe suggest a starting point. First of all, you don't actually have to call yourself an ally. It's not necessary to use that word. And actually that word gives a little bit of a wrong idea, because it can summon for some people this image of a person cheering on others from the sidelines. And this is why actually I like the synonyms that have been proposed out there. For instance, Dr. Ben Britton has made a useful suggestion that instead of saying ally, we should say accomplice, or even co-conspirator. An accomplice has skin in the game. They're not afraid of implicating themselves in an unpopular diversity or equity piece of work. And if there's pushback or hostility to marginalized people who speak up, then an accomplice is going to take the fall alongside them. A different take on allyship is one that I'll paraphrase from an LGBTQ organization, the 519 Space for Change. They have a really excellent infographic, and I'll post that in the chat for you. But the bottom line is this: stand behind to amplify marginalized voices, stand beside to support, and stand in front to protect. Repeat that last one: stand in front only to protect. These catchphrases might sound well and good, but are perhaps admittedly too abstract for any of you out there who are wondering what anti-racist work you can be doing right now or tomorrow or next week. So the last thing I'll say before handing over is that we've got to start with ourselves. We each have to start by educating ourselves about the history of marginalized groups. So you could order a copy of Angela Sani's book Superior, or you could check out some of the anti-racist reading lists, say from the Paleontological Society or the Bryn Mawr Mineralogical Collection. I'll link those as well in the chat. And then of course, keep showing up. Keep coming to panels like this. Definitely keep coming to talks given by minority voices. So I want to thank you for showing up today. Thank you for coming, giving us your afternoon. And I'll end there so that I can pass over to Connell.
Okay, hi. Can everybody hear me? Can anyone hear me? Okay, good. So my name's Conor McNichol. I'm the Director of Teaching, and I was one of the people who put together the departmental response to the report. So I don't want to talk for too long, because I think much of the ground has already been covered by people. There are just a few points I wanted to briefly make. Oxford is obsessed with admissions, and a lot of people are obsessed with Oxford's admissions. Because historically, Oxford's admissions have been a long, long way from being representative of British society as a whole. Chris has already alluded to the fact that in our Earth Sciences department, we're far from being representative of the UK population as a whole, particularly with regards to diversity in terms of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic members of the department. But I think one of the things that really stood out from this report for me was, of course, that it has to go beyond just the admissions, because we tend to treat admissions as statistics. And Oxford has made some great strides in recent years on the proportion of BAME students that are coming in. There's been a 50% increase in the proportion of BAME students that are being admitted in the last 5 years. So of course, our department lags the statistics on that. But I think for me, the thing that stood out from the report was actually about inclusion. Because it's all very well admitting people, but if they then come to a place where there are structures in place, or in a climate in place, or environments in place that prevent them from succeeding to the maximum of their ability, we haven't done our job properly. And one of the things I said, as I said, that this report brings out is it's not just hoping that we can attract a greater diversity of people into the field of geosciences. We have to make sure that the culture they encounter when they come in is inclusive, that they feel belonging, they feel they belong, they feel valued in what they do. As I said, I was one of the people who authored the reply to the report. And you'll notice that one of the things that we were very concerned about in that reply was that the burden of changing things should not be pushed onto the BAME members of our community. They do suffer from the lack of diversity, but I think also the field as a whole suffers from the lack of diversity. And it's very important that it's not just the BAME members of the community who have to put their shoulders to the wheel, it's everybody else. And it's everybody else because, in fact, we are the people who have sort of authored the lack of diversity in the field. And we are the people who are actually in a position where we can try and do something about it. So when we talk about a call to action, I think that was one of the subtitles that we had. We think it's very important that people try and push forward the diversity of the field. And one of the comments I made to Ben and Gwen this morning, it's very important that white males, middle-aged white males like me, always think we have the answers to lots of questions, even when they're outside our field of expertise. Very important that we actually shut up and listen occasionally, and listen to what the people in our field are telling us about the culture of the field and about the things that we can do to help them achieve their full potential in the field. I hope that's what we've tried to do in the response to this report. And I think, as both Ben, Gwen, and Chris have said, for us, the response to this report is not about ticking off 42 items on a list. What we hope is that it's an ongoing process, that we improve the culture both in our department and in the field. And our hope is that if a Ben and a Gwen were to come along in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, they hopefully wouldn't find 42 more things that we need to improve. So with that, I'm going to sort of say that really we hope people read the report, our response, pick out from that the things that they think are applicable to their own departments, the things they think that are general. And what we don't want is that equality and diversity committees become the sort of academic version of thoughts and prayers, but they're actually things that actually get people to do things in favor of improving diversity in the field of geosciences. I think it is Mike next.
Yes, I'm here, Connell. Okay, thank you, Connell. I'm Mike Daly. I'm president of the Geological Society in this position now, and I also have a visiting relationship with the university and the Department of Earth Sciences. As I read the Earth Sciences analysis of BAME and the issues, I was reminded about how 50 years ago now my parents were completely mystified and very concerned when I declared I wanted to be a geologist. I come from a small village in Yorkshire. They had no context of anybody having done geology. They had little sense of what it meant and where it might lead me. And most important, none of my friends were inclined in the same direction, and nor were any of my cousins or anything. They supported me, and 50 years later, I'm still striving to be a geologist, or now perhaps a geoscientist. But the risk they took on me was significant for them. That chimed with several of the lines of the report. The report also struck me as a great example of leadership. Business school tells you leadership starts at the top of an organization. The originators of the document are not there yet. But their act has brought us all here together, and there are over 200 people on the call at times now. That's happened because Chris and his leadership team of the Earth Sciences set a context that is highly accessible and responsive. And I think that's demonstrated in the way they've dealt with this. And Oxford University generally does this well. The sort of epitome of this listening that's gone on and the response, I think, is also something the Geological Society believes it is part of its value as well. And most of my comments are going to be about that now. And I'd like to share a perspective on how the Society is addressing the issues around diversity and also profession. And I'll share a perspective on how in other parts of the world, it seems to me geologists don't seem to have the same struggle to be recognised as perhaps we do in the UK. The Society has a membership of a little over 11,000 geoscientists. About 18% of them live overseas. And as well as being a member, you can generate a professional qualification called the Chartered Geologist status. Demographically, between the age of 20 and 40, the membership between the age of 20 and 40, there's a gender split of about 40% women, 60% men. Between 40 and 50, that fades to 35% women, and after 60, it drops to 10% women, which is one of the mysteries of the demographics of the Society. A 2018 survey of some 2,000 members revealed 5% considered themselves from a BAME background. These mysteries have sort of created quite a lot of interest inside the Society and recently crystallized a diversity, equality and inclusion statement. And the Society has also signed up to the Science Council's Declaration on Diversity, Equality and Inclusion. The latter clearly directed to allow individuals to achieve their personal scientific potential, irrespective of race, ethnicity, social background, but obviously with an underlying intent to foster greater diversity of ideas into UK research and technology. Over the past decade, the Society has been attempting to improve its appeal and bring geoscience to a wider audience. And it's achieved this, to some degree at least, by focusing on education and outreach efforts in high areas of deprivation, of which there are many in and around London, but also in the other major conurbations of the UK. It also runs Teaching the Trainer sessions for school teachers who teach GCSE and A-level subject, or who teach A-level geology, and focuses on more direct educational linkages on particular issues like planetary geoscience or minerals and things. It runs career days with industry and government and major institutions where geologists are represented, like the BGS. And they highlight the full range. The intent is to highlight the full range of careers open to an earth scientist, but which are earth scientist degrees, because of course, outside of earth sciences, geologists and earth scientists do many other things. You may have seen some of these products. It's all available on our website, and it does draw young people to come and visit the Society just on a quite random basis, partly to see what happens at meetings, what people talk about, and what the vibe in the place is as people are interacting and being geologists. With this work has come an increased consciousness that observational natural science does need to be accessible to everybody. And the current degree accreditation system that operates is being reviewed. And that's a big part of that is fieldwork generally and this accessibility issue specifically. And also the issue of increasingly disadvantaged students who have other responsibilities other than educating themselves, like caring for folk and family. These examples hopefully give you some indication of the D&I activity of the Society. For a sense of the people behind the wheel, though, I'd refer you to have a look at the council. The Society is run by a committee, a council, who comprise volunteers who put themselves forward to serve our science, and they compete to be voted on to be put onto council. This happens annually. It's a 3-year commitment they make, and the basic governance is the structure There's a president who's the sort of chair of the council who are the people who make the decisions and the strategy of the society. And then there's the executive secretary who execute it all. Each council member gives their time and capability to the society. There's a nominated DEI champion amongst them, but each council member, I truly believe, thinks of themselves as a D&I leader. And if you go to the web and Google the Geological Society Council, you'll find a list of the council and see that industry, government, and academia are all well represented. It's a 40-60 women-men split, and 10% of council is of BAME representation. Clearly, council is work in progress, and that diversity is work in progress. But if you're interested enough to read on, if you click on the link, you'll find something about these people and their bios. It's not a perfect representation of membership of the UK geological community or community at large, but it does reflect hugely the diversity that earth sciences offers as a career and the people who are active in it. And as a body, they are the most diverse council that has yet appeared in the Geological Society. And I think they are an interesting group of people to sort of explore as an indication of things changing in the society. One of the other things I picked up in the paper was the issue of profession. It was pointed out that the familial and cultural expectations, as I think Ben mentioned this, are often stated to be a barrier to entry into geosciences. That a degree in geosciences is less attractive to parents, perhaps family members, than the professions of law, accountancy, medicine, engineering, for example. Of the geoscientists in the society, 3,000 of them are professionally chartered geologists. And they get that status by a level of work experience and achievement. And reading the recommendations in the report, it struck me that when we talk about being geoscientists, we rarely, if ever, talk about it as a profession. It's more an interest, a passion, something epic, something deeply interesting, all-consuming. Perhaps also something that sets us a bit apart from those people who do conventional professions. A tendency of many geologists has been to determinedly be non-establishment, and with good reason. You know, our science has had a long battle with the religious establishment about both evolution and the extent or duration of time. And in the early days of the Geological Society, it was awarded a much valued Royal Charter in acknowledgement of the contribution it had made. But the leaders who gladly accepted the charter decided not to use the royal title. So it's always remained the Geological Society. That was certainly the equivalent of let's say, a stand against the establishment of its day. Perhaps if it will help us to compete for diverse talents, the time has come for geoscientists to professionalize to some degree. And even my academic colleagues who are on the panel here, taking on a responsibility for the profile and status of our science, which they do, and we all stridently claim is fundamental to the planet's future. So perhaps at the next Parents and Students Day, we should point out that geoscience is a science, but it's also a profession, that it involves activity from the frontiers of planetary research, as Chris said, to execution of the UK's multi-billion-pound infrastructure projects that are going on at the moment. It's a profession that is providing water to society in many parts of the world, and a science that will help us understand the mitigations required to deal with climate change, coastal defences, flooding, the urban environment. It's a profession that does touch almost every aspect of 21st century life and has roles to suit every race, ethnicity, and gender, I'm sure. So quick final last word about geosciences outside the UK. For the past 5 years, I've been working on a field-based project in Zambia. Other than me, the 6-person team is entirely Zambian and has a 40% women component, and it's led by a Zambian who was educated in Imperial College. The team love the fieldwork, are hugely committed, variously skilled. They've been to GeolSoc meetings because or when things of time has allowed. and stars have aligned for that to happen. And they participate hugely in the fraternity and the debate of the place. I have similar relationships in other African countries, in Brazil, and it always strikes me as the cultures of these countries is unique. But there's one thing in common. Geoscience is perceived as a worthy profession. They're proud of being geoscientists, and their families are proud they're working as geoscientists. They help keep the nation's industries going. They help develop them. They help themselves and their families to thrive. And they do reputable jobs, and they do something that's interesting, challenging, and deeply personally rewarding. Reflecting on this clarity these guys have, I wonder how we can best describe the possibility of a geoscience career in the UK, both for a prospective student and particularly for their family. Perhaps we need to equip parents with an understanding of the bigger purpose behind being a geologist, so they can feel good about what their kids do and revel in the possibility that their daughter or son could become, you know, the driver of the rover around Mars, or in search of a contingent planet, or doing some of this fantastic engineering that's going on around the countryside in Britain. So including that with, as well and alongside explaining how great Oxford and the Earth Science programme is. It's very clear for my African and Brazilian colleagues, perhaps because their choices are less. Perhaps it's not so clear in parts of the UK society because of the lack of visibility of geoscience. This is something we can solve by taking our science as an essential agent of society, or by talking of our science as an essential agent of society. Not something distant and detached that only happens in mountain belts in Europe, or even further afield, or in oceans in the Pacific and down trenches in the Pacific. But something fundamental to the future of sustaining our planet, something highly technological and something highly professional. So on that, I'm going to pass over to Philip, who will tell us a little about the RAS.
And thank you for inviting us along to the meeting. Can you hear me okay? Good. Right, well, firstly, I should explain, what's the Royal Astronomical Society doing here? Are we interlopers? But actually, we also cover, as well as planetary geologists, we cover geophysics too. So we have an overlap with our colleagues at the Geological Society. So that's why we're here, and I'm going to be very brief. But what I want to say is to welcome this very interesting and thought-provoking report that you've written. Ben is actually a member of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, but also our new network of young researchers, early career researchers. Natasha Stephen, who's here too, did correct me this morning about apologies. But really what I want to say is that we represent a community, as do the Geological Society. We have ourselves undertaken a demographic survey a few years ago just to see what our representation is like. And the answer is obviously could be better. We are here to learn. We are here to improve. We are here, I think, to do some facilitation and communication with our members and the other routes of communication that we have to other departments in the UK and internationally to share best practice. I think we're here also to partner and collaborate, and I look forward to working with Michael and his society to make sure that what we do is not in competition with each other, but is collaborative and supportive. I think we're also here to consciousness raise with our members, many of whom understand the issues and the priorities, but some are yet to be brought to the party. And I think we have a role there to do that, to make sure that everybody understands why it is so important for us to be working on BAME issues and other diversity issues. So we will go away and think about the report, digest its contents, and talk to our trustees and our council about what is relevant and can be adopted ourselves, and also make sure that we broadcast with Ben's help, and thanks for his permission, to other departments in geophysics, but also in astronomy. I was very interested with Gwen's comment about intersectionality, and clearly I feel there's intersectionality between geophysics and astronomy, and the lessons we learn from you, we want to take into our astronomy community as well. So I wish your report luck. I hope many of the recommendations that are adopted have real impact. And when we come back next year and in future years, we will start to see an improvement in representation. So thank you all.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. I know that many of you will have to leave now as it's been an hour, but we are willing to stay on until 5:30. We also have Natasha Stephen, who is a member of the EDI, well, she's actually EDI committee chair for the RAS, and she'd like to say a few words. So I think I'm going to invite her to say a few words right now, and then we are going to take some questions. So I've had questions submitted by our audience members, and we'll be here until about 5:30 being able to address those questions. But first, Natasha.
Hi, thank you, Erin. I hope everyone can hear me. I apologise for the audio quality. I've had to relocate outside as it's after 5 and we're back in the lab this week. I just wanted to follow up from Phil and say that we've had the Committee for Diversity in Astronomy and Geophysics at the RAS for a while now. And I took over as chair last year, and I think one of the things that was highlighted in our demographics report recently was that we see a drop-off at each career stage within astronomy and geophysics. And if you want to look down through the demographic data, it is available for each of the sub-disciplines, so geophysics, planetary geology, astronomy, etc. And it's really interesting that with the BAME proportion of people at each of those career stages, the higher you go, the less representation there is in other groups. So just looking from the PDRA level up to the permanent academic position level, we see a drop-off from what is 91% white to 95% white. And they're already shocking statistics. And we can ask lots of questions about how to better encourage people to stay in the community, but get people into the community in the first place. And I think, you know, we're only looking at a very brief statistic there. I think it was over 900 respondents from the RAS fellowship in those statistics. And it was very clear that those numbers are disproportionate when you compare them to the British census, the most recent census in the UK. It was 87.1% white in terms of the last census data that we had. And yet for the British respondents in the RAS fellowship, we're looking at 95% white for the same population. So there really is a discrepancy there, and it's a problem that's, as others have mentioned, it's something that, you know, it really does need addressing. And by having this data, it helps highlight the problems, but we really need to come together and find those solutions. So the RAS are very supportive of the work that's been done here, and we're very, very glad to have Ben on our committee as well to help us address some of these things. And as Phil mentioned, we just started the Early Career Committee as well to try and make sure that we're getting that representation across the board. So we're not just expecting those in permanent academic positions to talk about these problems. We want to make sure that we're addressing them from the very, very early stages as well. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you to everyone for participating in this discussion. As I said, we'll now address some of the questions that we received from individuals, both submitted beforehand, but also in the chat to myself. So we have a question here, which is, I would like to know how to call more senior people out on their racism, especially when they have influence on my career. Similar questions that I received in the same theme are how to stop harassment and microaggressions on marginalized people.
I guess I can start, Erin, if that's all right. Yeah, I would say it's a really difficult thing to do, actually, especially when you feel like you know, calling someone out could impact you or your career. And even if it doesn't impact your career, I don't think anyone ever feels good about having to do it. So it carries a mental toll with it as well. I think the way to avoid it is cultural changes in institutions. Now, those are obviously really difficult to do, But if you can create a culture where it is just not considered acceptable to say those things, you end up in a situation where it's much easier for people who are, you know, junior, underprivileged, in any sort of way, disadvantaged in that relationship, to be able to say, no, you know what, that's actually not an okay thing to do. And in terms of concrete actions, I guess, you know, maybe Connell will have thoughts too, but I would think being clear that you will take seriously and respond appropriately, but also fairly to concerns that people make, but also being willing to have those conversations. I mean, you know, I don't quite mean just sort of a chat in the pub, but if we become more comfortable as a community talking about these sorts of things, it becomes easier to say to a friend, hey, you know what, I think what you said was out of line. Of course, it's still harder to say that to your boss, but if there is an expectation that we support each other by saying, hey, look, that wasn't okay, it becomes much easier to bring that across through the whole community rather than just relying on specific individuals to do it.
Yeah, and I was going to follow that up, because when we had this discussion earlier, we also said that, you know, it shouldn't be up to the junior people to call out this kind of behavior. It should actually, senior people should be taking a stand and calling out bad behavior whenever and wherever they see it. And the other thing we said was that it's very important for junior people that even if they feel they can't call it out there and then, they feel that they have someone to go to who will act on the things that are brought to them. And so that, you know, they don't think, well, if I bring it to this person, they're just going to mumble it in somebody's ear down the pub and brush it under the carpet. You know, it's very important that people feel that they will be listened to and action will be taken.
I think that goes right to the heart of what Gwen was talking about earlier in terms of allyship, making sure that those people who are senior enough to act and defend and play a role in exactly that environment are so important, and we need to make sure that we signpost and advertise and make sure that anybody who is in a junior role who feels harassed knows somebody senior that will work with them and make sure that it's investigated and addressed.
Yes, absolutely. So the next question that we received was, what are the main ways the department means to measure the success of implementing the strategies that you have been discussing, particularly in the near or short term, and maybe beyond just statistics?
So I was going to pick up on this. I mean, the first and most immediate way of measuring what we're doing is to see how many and how rapidly we can implement the recommendations from this report. So that would be the first thing we'd start to do. The longer term measure, of course, will be success in diversifying the demographics of the department, and not just at undergraduate level, but also at graduate level, also at postdoctoral level, and ultimately at faculty level. So they're the sort of steps. And of course, this, you know, I don't like using the word statistics, because what we're actually dealing with here is people. It's not statistics. We're not just trying to get numbers right. We're actually trying to get more people from BAME backgrounds into positions within the field, and then ultimately into positions of authority within the field. But the short-term measures will have to be, are we doing all the things we said we'd done, and are there other things that we could be doing? And then the longer term measures will be, are we succeeding in having a more diverse population, a more diverse group of people interacting and working together in the department?
And with care always being there, that is shouldered amongst everybody within the department, that we're not putting those responsibilities just on the BAME individuals. That's something that you mentioned earlier, that has to be explicit in department strategy to make sure that we're looking after that properly.
Fantastic. So another question that we received is, I'm concerned about some of the points where it asks BAME students, staff to put in extra time and effort, such as becoming a departmental harassment advisor or taking part in showcases. These groups may feel themselves pressured into doing these extra things which their white counterparts do not have to do, a so-called minority tax. How will you encourage white people, particularly white men, to take up these roles, as well as BAME people who have already have many extra burdens to face? Ben, would you like to take this question first?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because on the one hand, it's very true that, you know, people from minorities, be that women or ethnic minorities, you know, if there needs to be a BAME rep on the Equality Committee and there's only one non-white faculty member, well, unfortunately, you do disproportionately burden them. But I guess on the other hand, I think, you know, many BAME members who have been very privileged, like I am, just to be able to come to Oxford, also recognize that we do have an obligation to our communities, i.e. the BAME community in the UK, if not necessarily to the university, to try and help them and to realize that we are from a disadvantaged background, but we're still also incredibly privileged. I think the way to tackle that is twofold. The first is to create a culture where everyone feels obliged to do their bit in contributing to equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it may take different forms for different people. For, you know, to go speak to a group of disadvantaged kids in, say, Bradford or East Ham, as Chris said, I think it's fair to say that, you know, they'll probably relate better to someone from a BAME background. But, for example, in writing this report, the role of non-BAME allies like Gwen has been great. And that's something where people can really take on board some of the support work without necessarily claiming to speak for or on behalf of those communities.
Fantastic.
Can I jump in as well with something else on that? I'd just like to highlight the Nature article that some of you might have seen that came out last week. And Professor Jackson has kindly linked it very high up in the chat, if you scroll up, where there were interviews with, I think, 6 different people about exactly this sort of problem and asking for sort of suggestions or advice. And it's well worth a read. One of the things that stuck out to me that I really took to heart from that is that if you are from an underrepresented group and you are getting asked or offered these extra commitments, you can bargain with that and say, yes, I am willing to do this very visible thing because I think it's going to be very important or impactful, but where else can we lessen my workload? How can we make sure that this is still going to be balanced overall and I'm not going to be asked to do more in total? So it's not necessarily a matter of always adding things on top of everything else. It is sometimes possible perhaps to add on new commitments and shift other commitments onto other people. That was something from the Nature article that I thought was a really valuable suggestion.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, one of the things that we were very insistent on in looking at our response to the report was that we explicitly don't want these activities to be a burden on the BAME members of our department. And as I said, you know, the issue is not of their making, the issue is of, you know, our making. And actually what we need to do is listen, but we're the ones who are going to have to do much of the heavy lifting. And, you know, people shouldn't think that this is just a problem that only affects BAME members of society. It's actually a problem that affects the entire field, and the entire field suffers because of it. So it basically means that everybody has to jump in and try and work to improve the situation.
Great, thank you very much. So another question that came in, which I know we touched on already in our discussions this afternoon, was what are some of the ways this report can be translated more widely to other institutions, universities, and even nations? Mike, do you want to take a crack at this question?
Well, I have a comment or two to make on it. I think it's an interesting question. I think it would be something that would be really interesting to do, because I think that it really pushes on to some degree on this notion of intersectionality that The countries that look like us, and I don't want to go into too much about who that might be, but I think the US and I think much of Western Europe probably would recognize a lot of what's in the original report in part, and would understand that it's an issue for them. And my equivalent in the GSA, the Geological Society of America, and in the AGU, the American Geophysical Union, the latter less so perhaps, but the former would recognize the problem and would recognize that the issues that are the solutions that are some of the solutions that are presented in the report would be things they could benefit from. I think where it'd be more mystifying and actually more interesting from a point of view of how we can help would be in some of the emerging countries where the opportunities for geoscientists are much less. But actually, if there is an opportunity, it's probably a much higher in society sort of job. You know, you're probably propping up or working with a national company, a national mining company, a national oil company, a national company of some sort. And there, the support from a family to become a geologist is probably much greater, because it brings with it a much bigger amount of recognition, a positive reputational thing. It pays well, and it's a way of competing internationally, because you are joining an international industry. So I think that to do that would be an interesting exercise. And actually, if Ben or Gwen or someone is interested in pursuing that, I'd be interested in putting a few names out there of people we could perhaps talk to who may be interested in it. I guess the more broader you cast that net, the more we would learn about how society perceives geoscience in this present world. And clearly, the state of development of a society is proportional to how you see geoscience.
Thank you, Mike. Any other comments from the panel? Our next question is a very interesting one that came in. They said that I heard rural people are more likely to do geology because of their familiarity with it, and they are also less likely to be BAME. Is this true? And if so, what can be done to address this issue?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I wonder whether Connell might be able to give us some stats on the urban-rural breakdown for our undergraduates, but I don't think it's something we collect in a useful way at the moment. No. Is it true in a statistical sense? I don't know, and I wouldn't care to guess. Could you see that there's perhaps a feed through of ideas or thinking that might come about more from being in the countryside in a family setting? Maybe, but of course that there are two responses to that. You know, the hard bit would be to get more kids from disadvantaged backgrounds out in the countryside seeing geology. I don't think that's our role. I don't think it's something that we can achieve. The other side is showing that geology doesn't need to just be about going outdoors and getting muddy 10,000 miles from home in a field for 6 weeks in the rain. Definitely not talking about New Zealand. But, you know, it's that there's a role to be played, of course, for field work. I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of it, but part of that is also showing that, you know, there are lots of different kinds of field work that you do. You know, my field work is done by a robot on Mars. I've never been, sadly, but other people might do their field work in other ways remotely. And similarly, part of that comes into the inclusion thing. I think from speaking to the undergrads that I've taught, most of them really enjoy the outdoors fieldwork aspect when they've done it, if it can be done in a controlled setting. You know, they can choose where they go. part of that can be overcome by introducing students to it in a more controlled and sustainable setting, making sure that when they go on their first field trip, they feel comfortable doing that. So obviously that's not quite the answer about rural people doing geology and urban people not doing geology, but we can do something to reassure disadvantaged communities who are disproportionately urbanized and disproportionately BAME in this country that we will teach them how we do fieldwork skills rather than it being something they were expected to pick up from going camping with their parents.
Yeah, Ben, those are some really excellent points about how we can support people from urban communities who haven't had these outdoor experiences to feel welcome and interested in geosciences. I was curious actually about the flip side as well of I think there are real problems, people of color outdoors. And this has been really clear on social media the last few weeks with hashtags like Black Birders Week and Black in Nature. There's some real physical safety issues there. And in the US, there are hard statistics on just how white the outdoorsmanship community is. And I think there's been some good starts on addressing that culture in the US. For instance, campaigns to get people into national parks, making sure that all the signs are bilingual so that Hispanic people can read signs and come in, feel more welcome coming into national parks. So I think there's some efforts there that we could perhaps look into and engage with. So there's sort of two sides of making sure that people actually can feel safe and welcome going outdoors in their own lives, and also making sure that we're reaching out to people in urban settings and not glorifying this field component of geoscience.
I was just going to say, I don't think there are any good stats on it.
If you like stats, O'Connell, I can give you some stats. So first of all, some stats then. From a membership of the Geological Society point of view, 60% of the 11,000, 12,000 members live south of a line if they're drawn between Cardiff and the Wash. Now you wouldn't be surprised with that. That's where all the jobs are. That's where people live. But that anywhere there, it's very difficult to call something really rural there. I mean, there are rural environments, but they're not in any way wild. The society also has members in the Shetland Isles and the Channel Isles, and that's so there are people all over the country, but by far the dominant population of working geosciences and career practicing ones are in that catchment of Cardiff and south. And I'm not sure that rural. Were we in a different conversation here? One of the things that could be pointed out is that a lot of Britain's small rural villages are devoid of young people because they all go to the cities, and that's true, not just in Britain, but it's true in most countries of the world. So there is certainly a migration out of the city because people want the opportunity out of the rural areas because people want the opportunity of a city. So, and yet it's also true that, as Gwen said, that there is a dearth of it being part of the culture for certain parts of the population to want to go and spend a week in the Lake District or Scotland and get wet and all the rest of it. But I think in this, the really important thing for us is that geology has changed. It's no longer this thing about exploration and exploitation. It is now about stewardship and sustainability. And that directs it to be as much an urban science and a science about infrastructure and the way we live in our crowded areas, as it is about the outdoors and climbing mountains and all the stuff that was true of when I was a student. So I think this notion of urban geoscience, or the humanosphere as it's often now called, the bit between the lithosphere and the atmosphere, where we all live, that space is where geology is being enacted. And it's being enacted by looking at geohazards, and it's being enacted by all the shallow monitoring that goes on of virtually everything that is man-made these days. So I think there is clearly something we need to help people with appreciating nature. And if you live in a city, it's not just, I don't think there's the problem to me is not an ethnic one. It's a problem of people who live in cities actually who getting the opportunity to appreciate the world outside their city. And that is something that I think as geoscientists we can help with, because it is something that you need to be trained in. And many people who that is part of their culture, they're trained in it from the age of 5 and 6, or even earlier when they're dragged off to the hills by their parents. If that hasn't happened to you, you need to be trained in it. And to not just about boots and helmets, but actually about how to appreciate it, the glory of it, what. And it's not just about rocks; it's about birds, it's about trees, it's about the natural environment. How much of that we do as an Earth Science department, I don't know, or should do it, I don't know. But it is part of sharing that passion of a different environment to the one you live in.
So, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I think there's one last question that we should address, particularly because it's relevant to exactly what we've been talking about right now, which is, as a BAME person, the question we usually ask is, will we get jobs when we graduate? Apart from the oil and gas industry, geology in the UK is perceived to be a special club for non-BAME people. And certainly there are many more opportunities than oil and gas. And so panel members, would you like to take that question? And then at the end, Ben is going to do a sort of 2-minute wrap up of how you can implement this type of report, these types of initiatives in your own institutions. So in the last few minutes, we'll address that question, and then how do you apply this to your own institutions?
Okay, so I guess the first thing we have to do is make sure that we actually communicate the range of career opportunities, and that was partially addressed in the reports. We have to make it very clear that the geosciences are not just about sucking hydrocarbons out of the ground, and that there's a wide range of careers that they can go into. And in particular, because much of our discussion has taken place around areas of socioeconomic deprivation and the intersections between the different minorities and urban environments and coming from areas of socioeconomic deprivation, we have to be communicating things like engineering geology to them, hydrogeology, erosion management, all sorts of fields where geoscience is important, but that's outside the field of hydrocarbons. So some of it is just communication. Some of it is just communicating to them that there are a range of valuable and professional careers out there that they can pursue that aren't all about exploitation of resources and sucking or digging things out of the ground.
I agree, Connell, and I think with a geology degree, you can also go into sort of non-geological or even environmental related fields. So you can take your geology degree and apply it to a wide variety of other sort of jobs, including coding, including environmental sciences, etc. So I think we're basically out of time, but Ben, would you like to sort of finish up and wrap up our discussion and talk about how we can potentially translate what you have done to other institutions?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I guess, this was quite a difficult and lengthy process to go through. I think at some points, the department probably found it a little bit uncomfortable, as Chris was saying in his introduction, what we were doing. But for those who are sort of interested in taking some of this on themselves and bearing in mind that people have different amounts of time and institutions are differently receptive to things, I would suggest that some of the items in here, we've gone through and marked out the ones we think the department should do and those they should just look at, and the department's responded. Some of these are pretty simple and quite reasonable asks. So just to point out, number 3, encourage each research group in your department to have one publicly available outreach resource that people can look at between a whole research group to put that together over the course of a few months or a year. It doesn't need to be much, but that seems like something that would be quite reasonable to do. Similarly, ensuring that on your website, item 9, that you showcase the diversity of careers that people from your field can go out to, and thinking a bit more than sort of the direct links out to academia, industry, or finance, as it seems to be. In terms of those that maybe require a little bit more thought, I think we'd encourage every department to go through and do a bit of a diversity audit like this. Originally, we thought, do we have one document? Do we have 2 documents? But I think this sort of question and answer approach has ended up working quite well, because now we understand some things that the department can't do for some reason or have previously been tried and failed. And they maybe see some of the motivation for us suggesting some things that might not have been otherwise sensible. So perhaps there's a setting to be done where some members of the department put together a response, a report like this, and then encourage the department leadership to reply. Or indeed, perhaps there's something more to be done about just encouraging a culture where people can bring forward these suggestions at any time. Because obviously, this is a particularly unusual time that we live in at the moment, so there might not be the scope to work through this full procedure at the moment. I don't know, Chris, whether you'd like to finish with just sort of some thoughts on how other people could handle this. There's always room to improve on how we did it, I guess.
No, I think what's really been important is the recognition that leadership doesn't just come from above, and particularly the role that you and Gwen have played in bringing together our earth science community and getting people to contribute from both from our undergraduates through to our graduates and postdocs and other staff is really important. And creating an environment where I hope you're able to do that is something that all institutes, I'm sure all institutes would reasonably aspire to. It's to provide different voices and a range of voices within a department, and then make sure that the department listens to that. And you've said it can be uncomfortable. We thought we were doing well, and then your report says, well, actually we need to think about more. And that's really important to make sure that we, as in the senior roles within the university, we do listen, and don't just listen, but actually take action and implement some of these key components, which and some of the ones you've highlighted are just plain good practice. For example, having those resources on who we are and what we do for different research groups, that will work in recruitment across the board. So this is a much more wide-ranging report than just BAME, and we really welcome the contribution that you've done. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think that wraps up our discussion. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us this afternoon, and I'd like to thank all of our panel members as well for their time and their efforts in these matters. And that closes out our day. So thank you.